For decades, Judi Dench and Maggie Smith were treated almost like rivals in the public imagination. Two legendary British actresses constantly compared, occasionally teased, and often placed on opposite sides of the same story. But the surviving record tells something more complicated. They worked together, played Travel Scrabble, appeared together in Tea with the Dames, and remained close friends for decades. After Smith died in September 2024, Dench planted a crabapple tree in her memory. So where did the rumors of tension actually come from? And what did these two women really think of each other? The first thing to understand about Judi Dench and Maggie Smith is that their story did not begin in Hollywood, on a film set, or even with the roles that eventually made them internationally famous. It began much earlier in the British theater world of the 1950s. Dench and Smith met as young actresses around the Old Vic Theatre in London. By 2015, when both women were 80, their friendship had already lasted roughly 6 decades. They were born only 19 days apart, and their careers developed through the same demanding British theater tradition before cinema and television eventually turned them into household names. That shared history matters because audiences later tended to see them as competitors. There was Dench, celebrated for her Shakespearean work, her stage performances, and eventually her roles in films such as Shakespeare in Love and the James Bond series. Then there was Smith, whose career carried its own extraordinary weight, from the stage to films such as The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, A Room with a View, and eventually Harry Potter and Downton Abbey. Both were decorated. Both were famously sharp performers. Both became dames, and both developed reputations for having little patience for nonsense. That made comparisons almost inevitable. But comparison is not the same thing as conflict. The public image of these two women was also shaped by their personalities. Dench was often seen as outgoing, warm, and surrounded by friends. Smith was considerably more private and could deliver a cutting remark with almost effortless precision. Later accounts of their friendship describe them as affectionate, but teasingly competitive. That distinction would become important, because when two performers are equally accomplished, equally respected, and completely comfortable making fun of one another, an audience can easily mistake the joke for hostility. And eventually, the cameras captured exactly that dynamic. In 2018, Tea with the Dames brought Dench, Smith, Eileen Atkins, and Joan Plowright together for an unusually intimate conversation about their careers and lives. The film did not present them as distant legends. It showed 4 longtime friends talking, teasing, remembering, and occasionally cutting straight through each other's carefully polished public images. For viewers who only knew the two actresses from their most famous roles, it was a revealing glimpse. And one exchange between Dench and Smith would become especially important, because it sounded at first almost exactly like the rivalry people had imagined. The cameras in Tea with the Dames captured something that interviews often miss. Not simply what Judi Dench and Maggie Smith said, but how comfortable they were saying it to each other. By the time the documentary was filmed, these were no longer young actresses trying to establish themselves. They were two women with decades of experience behind them, enormous reputations, and little reason to impress anyone. That made their conversations unusually direct. They joked about work. They teased one another. They interrupted. And sometimes, one of them would make a remark that could sound surprisingly sharp if the viewer did not understand the history behind it. That was part of what made their friendship so interesting. Dench and Smith had already shared the screen several times. Their collaborations included Ladies in Lavender, The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel, and its sequel, The Second Best Exotic Marigold Hotel. They could play very different characters, but their presence together carried an unmistakable familiarity. In The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel, released in 2011, both actresses were part of an ensemble filled with veteran British performers. The film became a major international success, bringing an older generation of British actors to a new audience. 3 years later, they returned for the second best exotic Marigold Hotel. But their relationship existed outside those films. One of the clearest public examples came with Tea with the Dames. The documentary allowed the audience to watch Smith and Dench interact without the protective distance of a conventional celebrity interview. At one point, the conversation turned toward their careers and the competitive nature of acting. Smith had a reputation for being brutally funny. Dench had one too, although her public persona often appeared more openly playful. Together, those qualities produced a rhythm that could look almost combative. But there was an important difference. Neither woman behaved as though she needed to win. Their teasing worked because there was already trust underneath it. That becomes clearer when looking beyond the documentary itself. A later Financial Times account described the two women as close friends who enjoyed playing Travel Scrabble together. Their competitiveness was real, but it was the kind of competitiveness that existed inside a much larger friendship. That detail matters because it changes how some of their sharper exchanges should be interpreted. Two strangers making the same comments might be starting a feud. Two longtime friends making them may simply be playing with each other. And Dench and Smith had been doing this for decades. Their friendship had survived changing careers, different professional circles, marriages, awards, international fame, and the enormous pressures that come with becoming recognizable public figures. They did not need to agree on everything. They did not even need to behave alike. In fact, their differences may have been one reason the friendship worked so well. Dench was generally more willing to discuss her personal life publicly. Smith guarded hers much more carefully. Dench often spoke warmly about colleagues and friends, while Smith became famous for using humor as a shield against excessive attention. Yet when they appeared together, those differences became part of the entertainment. The audience could see Smith make a dry remark, Dench react, and the conversation continue without either woman appearing genuinely wounded. That is why Tea with the Dames is so important to this story. It gives viewers something more valuable than a rumor. It gives them behavior, and behavior is often where the difference between friendship and supposed rivalry becomes easiest to see. Still, there was another side to their relationship that cameras could not capture as easily. The public saw the films. It saw the interviews. It saw the jokes. What it saw far less often was the ordinary friendship underneath all of that. That private side would become visible through stories about travel, work, games, difficult moments, and the small ways Dench and Smith understood each other. One particular episode from a British Vogue photo shoot in Los Angeles would later reveal just how well Dench knew her friend, and why their relationship could look very different once the cameras were gone. The rivalry story becomes much less convincing when the actual evidence is placed side by side. There is no well-established record showing that Judi Dench and Maggie Smith carried a secret feud for decades. What does exist is something far more ordinary, and in some ways more revealing. Two exceptionally successful actresses with strong personalities, different working styles, and a friendship comfortable enough to include competition and sharp humor. That distinction matters because celebrity rivalry stories often begin with something real. In this case, the real part was the contrast. Maggie Smith could be famously private and direct. She disliked unnecessary attention and was known for answering questions with a dry wit that could leave an interviewer unsure whether she was joking. Judi Dench, meanwhile, developed a reputation for being more openly sociable and enthusiastic about the people around her. They were different, but different does not mean hostile. In fact, some of the strongest accounts of their friendship describe exactly the opposite. They teased one another. They competed at games. They could make jokes at each other's expense. And because both women were established enough to say exactly what they thought, their conversations rarely sounded carefully rehearsed. That became especially noticeable whenever they discussed acting. Neither Dench nor Smith needed the other to validate her reputation. By the time their friendship was publicly documented in later decades, each had already built an extraordinary career independently. Smith had won 2 Academy Awards, while Dench had received an Oscar and numerous other major honors. Both had been recognized for their contributions to British theater and film, and both had become institutions in their own right. There was therefore no obvious career imbalance that would naturally explain a long-running personal feud. Yet the idea of rivalry remained attractive. Part of the reason was simply that audiences like comparisons. Who was the better actress? Who had the sharper wit? Who was more difficult on set? Who was more respected by directors? Those questions can turn admiration into competition, even when the people being compared never considered themselves enemies. The comparison also became easier because Dench and Smith sometimes occupied similar territory. They were both older British actresses who could move effortlessly between comedy and serious drama. Both could dominate a scene without needing to raise their voices. Both developed distinctive screen personas that audiences immediately recognized, and both were capable of playing formidable women. That made their friendship especially entertaining. When 2 people with that much confidence tease each other, the exchange can sound more aggressive than it really is. A later account of their friendship makes this distinction particularly clear. Their shared games of Travel Scrabble were competitive, and Smith apparently took winning seriously. But the competition existed inside a friendship that had lasted for decades. There is another important point. The public record contains plenty of material about their friendship. It contains shared appearances, interviews, professional collaborations, photographs, and recollections from people who knew them. What it does not contain is equally important. There is no solid evidence establishing that Dench secretly hated Smith. There is no credible basis for claiming that the 2 actresses maintained a hidden decades-long feud. And there is no documented confession from Dench revealing that their friendship was merely an act. That does not mean every interaction between them was perfect. Long friendships are rarely perfect. People disagree. They become irritated. They compete. They occasionally say things that sound harsher than intended. But turning those ordinary realities into a secret feud requires evidence that the surviving record does not provide. The more interesting story is actually the opposite. Dench appears to have understood Smith's temperament unusually well. And one episode from a British Vogue photo shoot in Los Angeles shows that understanding in a way no rumor could. In 2002, the 2 actresses were together for a shoot that was supposed to capture their friendship. Instead, Smith arrived unhappy. The hotel room was not right. The clothes were not right. The mood was deteriorating. For most people, that might have become an awkward professional problem. For Dench, it became something she knew how to handle. The episode happened in Los Angeles in 2002 during a British Vogue photo shoot featuring Judi Dench and Maggie Smith. On paper, it should have been straightforward. 2 celebrated actresses, both internationally respected, brought together for photographs celebrating their friendship and careers. But Maggie Smith was not impressed. According to a later account of the day, Smith arrived unhappy with her hotel room and dissatisfied with the clothes selected for the shoot. The atmosphere was becoming difficult, and the situation could easily have turned into one of those celebrity stories that gets remembered for all the wrong reasons. But Dench knew Smith. Instead of treating her friend's irritation as a personal insult, Dench reportedly understood that Smith simply needed to regain control of the situation. The solution was surprisingly practical. Dench suggested that jewelry be brought over. The idea was not to force Smith into a better mood. It was to give her something she could respond to, something that made the situation feel less restrictive. Eventually, champagne entered the picture as well. And slowly, the mood changed. The photo shoot went ahead. There was also Travel Scrabble. The game had become one of the recurring features of their friendship. It was not merely something they did for publicity. They genuinely enjoyed playing together, and Smith was known to take the competition seriously. That detail tells us something important. The friendship between Dench and Smith was not based on constant agreement. It contained competition, teasing, irritation, and strong personalities. But those things did not automatically become conflict. In fact, Dench's response to Smith's bad mood suggests that she understood a part of her friend that outsiders might easily misinterpret. Smith's reputation for being difficult was already well established. She could be blunt. She could be impatient. She could make an apparently devastating comment without changing her expression. But someone who only saw those moments might conclude that Smith was simply hostile. Dench apparently saw something different. She knew when to push, when to joke, and when to leave the situation alone. That kind of knowledge usually comes from time. And by 2002, these women had already known each other for decades. Their friendship had developed long before either became the global celebrity audiences recognize today. They had grown older together while working in an industry that constantly demanded reinvention. That makes the supposed rivalry even harder to reconcile with the evidence. A genuine long-term feud would require both women to maintain it through years of shared professional experiences and private friendship. Instead, the surviving stories show something messy, but much more believable. They could annoy each other, compete with each other, and laugh at each other's weaknesses while remaining close. The Vogue photo shoot is therefore more revealing than it first appears. The most interesting part is not that Maggie Smith became irritated. It is that Judi Dench seemed to know what to do about it. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public declaration, no evidence of a hidden war between two actresses, just familiarity. And that familiarity would become even more significant in the final decades of their friendship, when their conversations increasingly turned toward aging, memory, careers, and the people they had lost along the way. By the time Judi Dench and Maggie Smith entered their later years, their friendship had survived something far more difficult than a disagreement over a film role or a bad day on a photo shoot. They had simply grown old together. That sounds ordinary, but for two actresses whose careers had been followed for decades, it meant something unusual. They had watched the British acting world change around them. Colleagues disappeared. Friends died. The kinds of roles available to older actresses changed. And eventually, the conversation shifted from what they were going to do next to what they had already lived through. Their appearance in Tea with the Dames in 2018 offered one of the clearest public windows into that stage of their relationship. Dench, Smith, Eileen Atkins, and Joan Plowright were not presenting themselves as untouchable legends. They talked about their careers with the kind of humor that comes from having nothing left to prove. And Smith remained Smith. Her dry observations could cut through sentimental moments almost instantly. Dench often responded with laughter, keeping the conversation moving rather than treating every sharp remark as an insult. That dynamic was important because it showed that the friendship had not disappeared with age. If anything, the familiarity seemed stronger. They could tease each other because neither needed to protect herself from the other. The same year, audiences also saw them together in The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel, films where their shared screen presence had become part of the appeal. The films introduced both actresses to viewers who might have known their names, but had never followed their theater careers. For a younger generation, Dench and Smith became recognizable in a completely different way. One was M, the formidable boss in the James Bond films. The other was Professor McGonagall in Harry Potter. Both were now part of enormous franchises, but their friendship had started long before either of those identities existed. That history became especially meaningful as the two actresses began speaking more openly about aging. Dench continued working, although her health and eyesight later affected what she could do. Smith remained active as well, appearing in major films and television projects. Their careers were still separate. Their friendship was not. In 2020, Smith joined Dench, Kenneth Branagh, Derek Jacobi, and Ian McKellen for one night only, a charity event celebrating their careers and lives in theater. It was another reminder that Smith and Dench belonged to the same generation of British performers who had spent decades moving between stage and screen. Then, in September 2024, everything changed. Maggie Smith died at the age of 89. Her death prompted tributes from across the film and theater world. Actors who had worked with her remembered her talent, humor, precision, and extraordinary career. Dench's response was more personal. She did not describe Smith as a former colleague who happened to share a few films with her. She spoke of her as a great friend. That distinction matters, because if the supposed hidden story were that Dench had spent decades secretly resenting Smith, the public record after Smith's death would need to support that interpretation. Instead, the evidence points in the opposite direction. Dench continued to speak about Smith with affection. And then came a small gesture that carried more weight than any dramatic statement. After Smith's death, Dench planted a crabapple tree in her memory. Later, she recalled what happened around Smith's funeral. A tiny apple had appeared on the tree. It was picked and kept by Dench throughout the day. There was no sensational revelation in that story. No secret feud exposed. No decades-old accusation finally confirmed. Just a small memorial from one longtime friend to another. And that quiet detail would become the clearest answer to the rumors surrounding their relationship. After Maggie Smith died in September 2024, Judi Dench chose a remarkably simple way to remember her. She planted a crabapple tree. It was not a publicity event. There was no dramatic announcement designed to change the public narrative about their friendship. It was a private gesture that later became public because Dench spoke about it in an interview. And then came a detail that made the story unforgettable. On the day of Smith's funeral, Dench's gardener discovered a tiny apple growing on the tree. Dench picked it and carried it with her throughout the day. The detail is powerful precisely because it is so small. There is no need to turn it into something supernatural or claim that Dench believed the apple represented a message from Smith. The evidence does not establish that. What it does establish is that Dench had deliberately planted the tree as a memorial to a longtime friend. That puts the supposed rumors into a very different perspective. For years, audiences could look at Dench and Smith and see two formidable actresses competing for attention. They could hear a sarcastic remark from Smith, watch Dench laugh, and interpret the exchange according to whatever story they already believed. But when Smith was gone, Dench's actions were much harder to interpret as performance. She planted a tree. She remembered her friend, and she kept the small apple that appeared around the time of the funeral. Dench had apparently developed a habit of planting trees in memory of people she had lost. The practice gave her a way to preserve something living when someone important was no longer there. The crabapple tree therefore fitted into an existing personal tradition rather than appearing as a manufactured tribute for the cameras. That context matters. It means the tree was not evidence of some secret message. It was evidence of remembrance. And Dench's own descriptions of Smith point in the same direction. In later interviews, she referred to Smith as one of her great friends. That wording is difficult to reconcile with the idea that the two women had secretly maintained a bitter rivalry for decades. Of course, friendship does not mean perfection. Dench and Smith were human beings. They could become irritated. They could disagree. They could compete. They could make comments that sounded harsh. But none of those ordinary experiences automatically create a hidden feud. The evidence we actually have is stronger than the rumor because it comes from repeated behavior over many years. They worked together. They spent time together away from the camera. They played games. They teased each other. They appeared together in documentaries. And after Smith died, Dench continued to speak about her as a friend. That does not prove that every moment between them was harmonious. It does something more important. It shows that the central claim of a secret, decades-long hostility has no solid foundation in the available record. The tiny apple, therefore, becomes an unexpectedly useful final piece of evidence. It does not prove that Dench and Smith never argued. It does not prove that they always agreed. It does not erase every rumor ever written about them. What it does is reveal the relationship Dench chose to remember publicly when there was nothing left to gain from pretending. Not as a rival, not as an enemy, as Maggie, a friend she had known for most of her adult life. And that is where the story begins to turn away from rumor and toward the more complicated truth. The rivalry may have existed far more strongly in the imagination of the audience than it ever did between the two women themselves. The more closely the evidence is examined, the harder it becomes to support the dramatic version of this story. There is no credible record showing that Judi Dench secretly hated Maggie Smith. There is no documented confession from Dench revealing that their friendship was a carefully maintained public illusion. And there is no reliable evidence establishing a major private feud that lasted throughout their decades together. What the evidence does show is more complicated. They were close friends who could tease each other. They were both fiercely accomplished actresses. They were competitive at times, but that competition existed within a relationship that lasted for decades. That distinction is important because the word rivalry can mean very different things. In show business, two actors can be rivals professionally without being enemies personally. They can compete for roles, awards, critical attention, or simply the best line in a conversation. Neither person has to resent the other. Dench and Smith were particularly easy to compare because their careers followed some remarkably similar paths. Both established themselves in British theater before becoming major film stars. Both were recognized for Shakespearean work. Both became dames. Both won major acting awards. Both eventually became familiar to audiences who had never seen them on a London stage. And both possessed a quality that directors and audiences immediately recognized: authority. They could enter a scene and change its energy without needing to dominate it physically. Their voices, timing, expressions, and command of language were enough. That made them natural subjects for comparison. But comparison came from the outside. The surviving accounts of their friendship do not support the idea that Dench and Smith were secretly trying to destroy each other. Instead, they reveal something much more recognizable: two strong personalities who knew exactly how far they could push each other. The Travel Scrabble stories are a good example. Smith apparently cared about winning. Dench enjoyed the game too. Their competitiveness was genuine. But genuine competition is not evidence of resentment. The same applies to their jokes. When Smith delivered a dry remark and Dench laughed, the audience had a choice. It could interpret the exchange as evidence of tension, or it could recognize the familiarity between two people who had known each other for decades. The broader evidence favors the second interpretation. Their collaborations continued. Their friendship remained visible. They appeared together in Tea with the Dames, where their teasing was not hidden from the cameras. And after Smith's death, Dench spoke about her with affection rather than using the moment to settle an old score. That last point is especially important. If there had been a major secret that Dench wanted to reveal, Smith's death would have provided an obvious opportunity. Instead, Dench remembered her friend. She planted the crabapple tree. She kept the tiny apple that appeared around the time of the funeral. And she continued to describe Smith as someone she had loved and valued as a friend. None of this means every rumor about their relationship can be disproved individually. Some private moments between two people simply leave no public record. That uncertainty should be acknowledged. But uncertainty is not evidence for the most dramatic explanation. There is a temptation in celebrity history to take a funny disagreement, a sarcastic interview answer, or a competitive relationship and build an entire secret feud around it. Dench and Smith's story demonstrates why that can be misleading. The documented relationship was not perfectly smooth. It was human, and that may be the part audiences have missed. They could compete without becoming enemies. They could tease without becoming cruel. They could irritate each other and still remain friends. So the real question is not whether Judi Dench finally exposed a secret hatred of Maggie Smith. The available evidence does not support that claim. The more defensible conclusion is that the rivalry was largely a story imposed on two women whose similarities made them easy to compare, while their differences made their friendship entertaining to watch. And once that distinction is understood, the final years of their relationship take on a very different meaning. For decades, audiences were given plenty of reasons to compare Judi Dench and Maggie Smith. They were both towering figures of British acting. Both built major careers on stage before becoming international film stars. Both received the title of Dame. Both could deliver comedy with a single expression and drama with almost no visible effort. So it was easy to imagine a rivalry. But the surviving evidence tells a quieter story. Dench and Smith were not identical. They did not have identical personalities, identical working habits, or identical ways of dealing with fame. Smith could be intensely private and famously dry. Dench was often more openly affectionate and sociable. They also teased each other. They competed. They occasionally irritated each other. None of that makes them enemies. In fact, those imperfections are part of what makes their friendship believable. The strongest evidence comes from the accumulated record rather than one dramatic statement. Their friendship stretched across roughly 6 decades. They worked together, spent time together away from film sets, played travel Scrabble, and appeared together in Tea with the Dames. Accounts from people who knew them describe a relationship built on familiarity and affection rather than a secret campaign of resentment. And after Smith died in September 2024, Dench did not use the moment to reveal some buried feud. She remembered her friend. She planted a crabapple tree for Maggie. Then, around the time of Smith's funeral, a tiny apple appeared on that tree. Dench picked it and carried it with her that day. That small apple does not prove that the two women never argued. It does not prove that every rumor was false. And it certainly does not justify turning a private act of remembrance into something supernatural. But it does provide a remarkably clear picture of what Dench chose to preserve. A friendship, not a rivalry, not a secret grudge. A friendship that had lasted through changing careers, enormous success, personal losses, and old age. That is why the original title needs to be handled carefully. Judi Dench did not finally admit that the rumors about Maggie Smith were true, at least not according to the reliable evidence available for this story. The documented truth is actually more interesting. Two actresses who were constantly compared became friends long before the world knew them as legends. Their teasing was mistaken by some observers for hostility. Their competitiveness became part of the mythology surrounding them. And after Smith's death, Dench's own words and actions pointed toward affection rather than resentment. The public may remember them as two great dames standing side by side. But behind that comparison were two people who knew each other for most of their adult lives. And perhaps that is the detail worth remembering. Maggie Smith did not need to be Judi Dench's rival for either woman to be extraordinary. They could occupy the same generation, compete in the same profession, share the same stages and screens, and still become friends. The rumor made their relationship sound like a mystery. The evidence makes it human. And sometimes, the documented version is more meaningful precisely because it does not need a secret feud to make the story compelling. If the evidence changes how you see their relationship, what do you think their friendship was really like? For more documented stories from film and television history, subscribe.